So one of the major things that makes Italy different from Russia, which we already talked about, was its economic structure. Now we already know through the 5-year plans in the Soviet Union, everything is completely controlled by the state, right? Absolutely no ability to own property anymore. The state sets quotas, the state seizes grain. We know all these things. Now under fascist Italy, uh, the economy was organized into these corporations or syndicates. It was called the corporate state. Now, in a way, it's sort of a quasi-capitalism. The saying that went along with it, Mussolini's saying, was everything in the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. Okay, so in the corporate state, Mussolini did allow capitalism, all right, but everything had to serve the state, all right? So again, businesses could be independently owned, businesses could make profits, but everything a business created was meant to service Italy and not anyone else, right? So it's not complete and utter invisible hand laissez-faire capitalism, because that would mean that individuals could profit whether or not it would help the state. This means that you can profit, but again, you have to help Italy at the end of the day. And the idea was to create harmonious class participation in production, right? That the business owners as well as the workers were sort of all ultimately serving the state, all sort of working together in a harmonious way. By 1928, you saw all independent labor unions were organized into syndicates, which were government controlled. Okay, so again, it's not completely independent. It is not 100% capitalism because the government ultimately controls these labor unions. The government organized these syndicates so that strikes and walkouts were no longer permitted. So again, not complete and utter independence from government control over the economy. These syndicates were nationwide, so there was one for each industry. So for example, you could have an agriculture syndicate, an industry syndicate, commerce syndicate, sea and air transportation syndicate. And the idea was that individual businesses within a syndicate could be controlled and owned privately, but the overall corporation, which controlled the type of business, was controlled by the government. So in other words, an individual could own a farm, but the agricultural syndicate was controlled by the Italian government. All right. So this basically made it so that the government could, it still ultimately, it had control over how much was produced and where products went. You also saw that the authority, as far as economic production was concerned, was coming from the top, right, which is very different from socialist corporate states where the workers got to make the decisions. Again, the idea behind the corporate state was to make workers and employers work in harmony to serve the interests of the state, but we're going to see that this doesn't actually work. All right, under the corporate state, you aren't going to see an increase in production, and you're going to see that the capitalists benefit from the corporate state much more than the workers. All right, so the corporate state is not a success, even though it is Mussolini's sort of dream to allow some form of capitalism, but still ultimately benefit the state economically. So the corporate state, failure. But one of the important things to take away from it is how different the corporate state is from something like Stalin's 5-year plans. Okay. So how is Mussolini maintaining a dictatorship in Italy? First off, remember previously, before the rise of Mussolini, there was universal manhood suffrage, right? Well, under Mussolini, you're going to see that, first off, there's only one party that is in control, right? Just the fascists. Every other party has been suppressed. We talked about how the black shirts did that before Mussolini marched on Rome. You're going to see a severe limitation for the rights to vote, all right, and even people who can vote. Ultimately, elections were meaningless. Elections were fixed. All the candidates for the Italian party were effectively selected by the fascists. Okay, so the elections in a lot of ways were just for show. The government ruled by decree, which meant it got to make absolute decisions without parliamentary interaction. I mean, ultimately, the government had a lot of absolutist say. Any sort of dissent against this system would be blocked by the black shirts. You also saw that schools started to be controlled by dedicated fascists. So this meant that people from a very young age were raised and educated to believe that fascism was effective and fascism was the way to go, right? Teachers in schools actually had to take an oath of fascism. Teachers also taught their students that Mussolini was bringing Italy back to the great days, sort of, almost like a rebirth of the Roman Empire, right? So teachers were sort of shaping how young minds actually envisioned Mussolini's Italy. The government also was regulating people's leisure time. All right, so young people, for example, oftentimes joined fascist youth movements. One example of a fascist youth movement was the Balilla. Sorry about the pronunciation here. Here's a group of young boys who belong to this. Look, they basically look like mini black shirts. You also saw that labor unions were regulated by fascists themselves. We also saw that under the corporate state, right? You also saw that leisure activities for adults were controlled by the government. So one example of this is the dopo lavoro, all right? It means after work. This basically organizes even social activities for the working class controlled by the government. So this is a cyclist organization that is, again, controlled by the government. The idea was, even for after-work activities, to have a nationalistic undertone. But again, one of the major things that you need to keep in mind when you're thinking about Mussolini's Italy was that, unlike Stalin's Soviet Union and unlike Hitler's Germany, Italy was never completely totalitarian. Mussolini never became all-powerful. One of the reasons why we can remember this is because there still was always a king in Italy. Even if the king in some stages only had symbolic power, the fact that his position still existed showed that Italy was not completely totalitarian. Also, Mussolini does not 100% control leisure time, so this also shows that Italy is not completely totalitarian. You're also going to see that some of the old power structures remain intact. You're going to see that the conservative groups, the military, as well as the Catholic Church ultimately maintain a lot of power even after Mussolini starts to rule Italy. Mussolini never made the attempt to purge these conservative classes. Unlike Stalin, we know that purged everyone, even fellow communists. So because these purges did not exist, again, Italy does not become 100% totalitarian because some of these old institutions of power still remained. A really good example of how the church remains significant was the Lateran Agreement in 1929, which establishes the Vatican as a tiny independent state, really tiny. And Mussolini also agreed to provide financial support to the church. All right, so the church maintains a lot of sovereignty. You also don't see major land reform taking place in Italy like you did in Russia, for example. People who held land prior to Mussolini's takeover maintained it. So there's not as much of a shifting of hands in power when Mussolini takes control of Italy. Also, you don't have a really ruthless police state like you do in both the Soviet Union and Germany. Only 23 political prisoners are actually executed between 1926 and 1944. This doesn't mean that there was not a secret police. They did have one. It was called the OVRA, but they weren't such a great purging power like you saw in Russia and Germany. Also, you did not see the kind of sense of racism in fascist Italy that you saw in Germany. This was one of the major ways that Hitler tried to control opposing groups or ultimately what he did not see as truly German. Clearly I'm talking specifically about the Nazis' treatment of the Jews. You did not see this happen in Italy until much later. Italy did not impose any sort of racist laws or laws that subjugated certain racial classes until Italy was actually controlled by the German Nazis during World War II in 1938. Another important difference between Italy and Russia, for example, is that women really don't change as much. All right. Italy does not have as modern of an approach to gender, all right? Their social structure emphasized a much more traditional role for women. You don't, and this also becomes the case in Nazi Germany, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. So divorce and abortion are actually abolished in fascist Italy, and women are told to stay home and procreate. The best thing that women can do for fascist Italy is to produce more fascist Italian babies. In 1927, an event called the Battle of the Births began, and this was where Mussolini's government actually encouraged women to have more children. Families who had children actually would get tax relief, and bachelors, men who remained unmarried starting in 1934, actually had an additional tax imposed on them. So basically, the government was providing incentives to get married and have children. A major fascist idea was that stronger countries were meant to have larger populations. So women were meant to have children for the glory of Italy. Also remember that a lot of fascist states glorify warfare. So the idea is to, be producing a state that can ultimately provide a very powerful military. It was always in the back of their heads. You also had women restricted as to what they could do for work in Italy. By 1938, women were limited to only a maximum of 10% of the better paying jobs in industry and government. So basically, if women did work, they weren't able to get very high quality jobs as opposed to men. Also, the Battle of the Births movement that I discussed just a minute ago ended up being a failure. The population in Italy actually only increased in this period because life expectancy was increasing, not because people were having more babies. Okay, so as a takeaway, what kind of accomplishments are made in Italy under Mussolini? So there are some ways that Mussolini that tries to catch Italy up with other parts of Europe. Internal improvements to infrastructure are an important accomplishment under Mussolini. He contributes to electrify much more of Italy, basically furthering industrialization. He also contributes to significant road building throughout Italy. But even with these accomplishments in infrastructure, you still saw a pretty significant gap between the rural southern and urban northern Italians. Also, Mussolini worked to make the government more efficient at the city or municipal level. He also suppressed the mafia, which was especially strong in southern Italy and Sicily before his reign. So, in a way, you see that this is just another example of suppressing any sort of dissenting group or any group that could rise to power. There were improvements made to the justice system under Mussolini, with the exception of supposed enemies of the state. Arguably, the biggest accomplishment under Mussolini in Italy was the Lateran Pact. All right, basically, you see that the Italian government sort of reconciles with the papacy during this period. The Vatican, again, was recognized as a tiny independent state. It got a lot of money for previously seized church lands. It got $92 million. And in return, Pope Pius XII actually recognized the legitimacy of the Italian state. So really one of the biggest instances of accomplishment, one of the major takeaways of Mussolini and his control of Italy in this period was how he repaired relationships with the church. Some of the failures of fascism in Italy. First off, any sort of remnant of democracy in Italy, what had been established in the 19th century, both with the establishment of the liberal constitution in Sardinia, as well as the liberal government worldwide after Italy unified, that's going to be destroyed. All right, you're also going to see that even though there isn't as much purging in fascist Italy as there was in Germany, terror became a state policy, right? The idea was, you could not dissent against the fascist. You also saw that there was not as much industrial growth as as the state might have liked. Some of this is because Italy becomes increasingly militaristic as World War II approaches, as well as colonialist efforts. When Italy invades Ethiopia, that is a good example of a colonialist effort, right? This makes it so that Italy does not industrialize as much as it probably should have. You're also going to see, because Italy becomes more imperialistic, there are going to be some disastrous wars that we'll talk about when we get to World War II. Also, another major failure of the Italian fascists was that they eventually joined forces with Hitler with the formation of the Rome-Berlin Axis, which means that when both of these countries ultimately become the major enemy of the Grand Alliance, both of these countries are going to experience some significant downfalls when they're defeated in World War II. So we'll move on to fascist Germany in the next video.